Welcome back to educator.com. We're going to look at supply and demand, and more specifically, we're going to look at price and quantity. How to actually find equilibrium price and quantity on a supply and demand graph. So let's dive right back in. So today's lesson overview, we're going to describe what a competitive market is and how it is described by the supply and demand model. We're going to explain what a demand curve is and what a supply curve is. And we're going to show the difference between, and this is actually a big one, so pay attention for this one especially. We're going to show the difference between a change in quantity demanded versus a change in demand. This is a huge one that a lot of AP students maybe know these complicated graphs, but they'll be tripped up on this very basic concept here. We're going to determine how to find the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. And finally, we're going to graphically illustrate how the price moves the market back to equilibrium from a shortage or if there's a surplus. So let's take a look. So product market. So this is the first lesson of product units, and this is actually 55 to 70% of the AP exam. So the majority of the AP exam is actually the second topic in the outline, and so this is actually the part where there's a bulk of the AP exam is going to be based on here. So what is it that we're actually studying here? It's the study of the nature and functions of product markets, and it falls into four broad areas: supply and demand models. A well-planned AP course requires the analysis of the determinants of supply and demand and the ways in which changes in these determinants affect equilibrium price and outputs. In particular, the course helps students make the important distinction between movements along the curves and shifts in the curves. So again, that's something that we're going to highlight, and if there's the one important thing that will be tested in the multiple choice section is if you understand the difference between the change in quantity demanded versus change in demand. So let's take a look at supply and demand. So the supply and demand model is a model of how competitive markets function. Obviously, for the first part of the supply and demand model, you have the demand curve, which is going to be a downward sloping graph. So even a small graph like this, I'm going to make sure to label this here. And then you have the supply curve, which is an upward sloping curve, and you label it S1. We're going to look at the set of factors that cause demand to shift and the set of factors that cause the supply to shift. So, what would cause, so you take a look here, is the price here and the quantity. Sometimes the demand curve will shift to the right. And sometimes, let's go ahead and erase this. And sometimes the demand curve will shift to the left. Okay. And the same can be said about the supply curve. So we're going to look at, what actually causes the demand curve to shift to the right or increase to the right, and what will cause it to shift to the left or decrease to the left. And we're going to look at equilibrium price and quantity. So let's go ahead and take a look here. So demand schedule and demand curve. Market demand schedule shows how much of a good or service consumers will want to buy at different prices. Market demand curve is a graphical representation of the demand schedule and the market demand for used economic textbooks and change in quantity demanded. We'll go ahead and look at that particular market here. So let's take a look at used econ textbooks. So this is a market for used econ textbooks. All right, so we're gonna put the market demand schedule here. Market demand schedule, which is a relationship between the price and quantity. So we'll put the price right here, a little T chart, P and Q. Now, what are the different prices for econ textbooks? Let's just say that it starts at 10 20, 30, 40, 50, 40 here, not 45, and 50. Now I'm just creating a set of hypothetical numbers here. We know the law of demand is as price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. So let's say this is the market for textbooks in Los Angeles, and at $10 there'd be 1,000 people that would want it. At $20 it's 800. At $30 it's 600. At $40 it's 400, and $50 it's 200. Again, I just set up hypothetical amount. There's no rhyme or reason to that. But we do want to put Q here on the x-axis, and you want to put price here on the y-axis, and you want to label it accordingly here. So put a hash mark. So you go by 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. And on the bottom here, you go in 200, 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. So you have 200, you have 400, 600, 800, and 1,000. And what you want to do is, at that $10 mark, put dots right here. At 1,000, at $20, it's 800. At $30, it's 600. At $40, it's 400. And at $50, it's 200. So what you want to do here is, once you have that, you just connect the dots, and you have the demand curve. And you even though there's no change in demand yet, you want to just keep it as D1 right here, because if there is a change in demand, then you would label that as D2 here. One thing you do want to note, if the price increases from $20 to $30, then what ends up happening, let's say this is point A here, and this is point B. So if price of econ textbook increases to $30 from $20, what happens? A lot of people might say, oh, there's a change in demand. The price has increased, so there's a decrease in demand. Absolutely not. Make a note, no change in demand. What is it? There's a decrease in quantity demanded. Because the only variable that you're changing is price, so there's movement along the demand curve from A to B. And it decreases from 800 to 600. So nothing here changed the actual demand for econ textbook. When you actually just raise the price of the textbook, there is a change in quantity demanded, or there's a decrease in quantity demanded, but there was absolutely no change in demand. Again, this might seem like something very minor, but most AP exams will test you on this fundamental concept, because the only variable being changed with price, that's part of the actual equation. So when you just change the price, you're not actually changing the demand curve. You're just changing the quantity demanded. So we're going to go ahead and look at changes, shifts in the demand curve. We're going to look at changes in the price of related goods. And there's a couple of things that would cause the shift in demand curves. For example, substitutes. A fall in the price of one of the goods makes consumers less willing to buy the other goods. and there's a positive correlation to that. And then there are complements. A fall in the price of one of the goods makes consumers more willing to buy the other good, or there's a negative correlation. Okay. A really corny word association that I use, or sign association, is that if the price of a Pepsi goes up, then the demand for Coke increases as well. Whereas if the price of salt goes up, then the demand for pepper goes down. So there's a positive correlation with substitutes, but a negative correlation with complements. And the way I kind of have a corny way of referencing these two together is that when I'm not in my classroom and there's a substitute, then there's definitely a positive reaction. When there's a substitute, kids have a positive reaction to my not being there. Maybe because they don't have to work as hard, maybe for a variety of factors. And so I try to have a correlation that any substitutes, there's a positive correlation, as opposed to compliments. You know, we live in a cynical world, and so if someone gives you a compliment, maybe the first reaction might be like a negative one. Like if someone says, "Wow, that's a really nice sweatshirt that you're wearing," then the reaction might be a little bit negative. So we live in a cynical world. So that's kind of a corny way that I use to have students understand that substitutes have a positive correlation. So if there's an increase in demand, or if there's an increase in the price of a substitute, there's an increase in demand for the good. And similarly, if there's an increase in the price of a substitute, or if there's an increase in the price of a complement, there's a decrease in the demand for a complement because they're inversely related. So if there's any means for one of my students to memorize the substitutes and complements, then I'll be more than happy to utilize that. Another way that there's a shift in demand, if there's a change in income. There are normal goods, and they rise in income, it increases demand for that particular item. For example, computers, Disneyland tickets, or steak. These are all normal goods. If people make more money, then they're going to buy more of it. And then there's also inferior goods. There's a rise in income. It actually decreases demand. For example, if you win the lottery, you're going to probably buy less macaroni and cheese and less Top Ramen. You might buy more gourmet macaroni and cheese, but the 99-cent packets you see at the 99-cent store, you're probably going to buy less of that as your income increases. Shifts of the demand curve. Another reason why there might be a shift is change in tastes. And this one, really, there's no real reason why. People just have different preferences. Why do people want what they want? It's just unknown. Sometimes preferences change. So changes due to either fad, beliefs, cultural shifts are all clumped together under preferences. For example, let's say there's a study that comes out and shows that eating a particular fast food burger increases your vision. You know, people prefer better vision to worse vision, so the demand for that particular fast food chain will probably increase. Or if you watch a advertisement and for some reason that entices you to eat a particular product, then there's an increase in demand because of a change in preference. And there's also changes in expectations. So if you expect more income in the future, so you expect a raise, then demand for certain goods, for example, big ticket items usually like a car or a refrigerator, it might actually increase. Okay. Similarly, if there's expectations of a future price drop of an item, then the demand for these items drop today, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So for example, if you know a good or an item is going to go on sale the next month at 50%, then your demand for that particular good is going to decrease right now because you're going to want to make that purchase later on. So we're going to give a very brief example on how an increase in demand actually looks like in terms of a rightward shift here. So let's say you have, this would be good for laptop computers. Very simple here. So make sure you put Q on the bottom here and P on the y-axis here. Draw a simple downward sloping line here and label it D1. And if you want a rightward shift, usually just draw an arrow to the right here and you label it D2. It's very simple, but make sure you have all the labelings appropriate and you have a rightward shift or an increase in demand for any of the 4 reasons in the previous slides. There's a decrease in demand. Let's say this is a decrease in demand for tickets to play. And so on the x-axis would be the quantity once again. The y-axis would be the price. And you draw a downward sloping demand curve. And let's say for some reason the lead actor in the play decides to quit, and let's say he was a really popular actor. Well, some people might not want to watch the play anymore, so there's a decrease in demand for that particular play. So the demand decreases to the left. We don't know to what extent. So the demand curve shifts to the left here, and you have a decrease in demand. Now we're going to look at supply and supply chart here. And eventually we're going to combine them together. So let's take a look at a market supply schedule. What it does is it shows how much of a good or service producers will want to sell at different prices. Now, a market supply curve is a graphical representation of the supply schedule. And we're going to look at the market supply for used textbooks and change in quantity supplied. Very similar to what we did for a market demand schedule and market demand curve for textbooks. But now it's going to be market supply. So here's the market supply schedule. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the relationship between the price and the quantity here. And we'll use similar prices here at $10, $20, $30, $40, and $50. And you want to follow the law of supply when you're constructing numbers here. So as prices goes up, quantity supplied also goes up. So as prices go up, suppliers are going to want to supply more items here. So here's the market supply schedule. What you're going to do here is you're going to put quantity here on the x-axis. You're going to put price here on the y-axis. Put the appropriate hash marks. It's going to be 200, 400, 600, 800, 1,000, and $1, or $10, $20, $30, $40, and $50. 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50 here. So we're going to go ahead and make the marks here. And what you have here is a supply curve. As prices goes up, quantity supplied goes up. Now, one thing here that I mentioned here, to go from point A to point B, so if price increases, what happens to supply? Kind of a similar question I asked before, and the law of supply here is pretty apparent. If price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. However, if the price increases, what happens to supply? The correct answer, if asked like that, is nothing. Why nothing? There is a change in quantity supplied, not supply. So what ends up happening is that there is a change in quantity supplied. So this is a movement along the supply curve. which is different than a change in supply. Something other than price has to change in order for it to be a change in supply. A movement in the supply curve only moves up and down the supply curve, and there's no change in actual supply. So let's take a look at shifts of the supply curve. So what would cause the supply curve to shift? One reason would be a change in input prices. And what is an input? An input is a good used to produce another good. For example, cheese in a cheese pizza, that's an input. So if the price of cheese increased, that would decrease the supply. Secondly, changes in technology. So all the ways in which people can turn more easily, all the ways in which people can easily turn inputs into useful goods, that would be a technology situation. So turning inputs into useful goods. For example, an improved strain of corn resistant to diseases increases the supply of corn. And finally, changes in expectations. So if expectations of future price increase of items exist, then suppliers will tend to hoard the item in order to make more profit in the future. For example, if I knew for some reason this pen right here that you see, it's going to go up 1,000% next month, then the rational thing for suppliers to do is to supply less right now, so supply would actually decrease of these pens here. So let's take a look at an increase in supply. So put quantity here on the x-axis, price here on the y-axis here, and we're going to draw a supply curve here. And so let's look at this as pizza. So again, if the price of cheese goes down, if the price of cheese increases, actually, we don't want the price of cheese to increase. If the price of cheese decreases or goes down, then what's going to happen is that the supply curve is actually going to shift to the right. What's actually happening is that at different points, instead of at these points here, there's going to be new points, because at these prices, there's more points of profitability. So suppliers are just simply going to decide that they want to produce more pizza. So supply actually increases. That's what's meant when the supply increases. Now, a decrease in supply. Now let's take a look at the market for hamburgers. Again, you want to label the x-axis and the y-axis. All right, let's say that the government adds a tax to producers on hamburgers. So every hamburger that's produced, there's a $1 tax. Well, that's going to have a negative impact on the market for hamburgers. What's going to happen is that suppliers are going to want to produce less. They have a decreased incentive in producing hamburgers, so supply will actually shift to the left here. And you have S2. So what we're going to do right now, we're going to put supply and demand together here. So we're going to take a look at the equilibrium price, and that's the price that clears the market. We're going to look at the equilibrium quantity. This is a quantity of good bought and sold at the market clearing price. So again, we're going to take a look at the quantity and the price here. And so what is the equilibrium, except it's where the supply and demand curves intersect. So let's take a look at an example for, this is the supply and demand for gasoline. So I'm going to use blue here for this is the supply of gasoline, labeled as S1. And there's also clearly a demand for gasoline, labeled as S2, or not S2, D1, I'm sorry. And again, make sure you label the x-axis as Q and the y-axis as P. So what is the equilibrium? If you can actually see right here, it's where supply and demand intersect here. Let's label it E1. And this is Q1 right here. and this is P1. So this is the market clearing price. If the price is higher, then you're going to experience a surplus. If the price is lower, then you're going to experience a shortage. So let's take a look at this surplus and shortage situation here. So surplus is when quantity supplied exceeds quantity demanded. So it's when the quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. Shortage is exactly the opposite. A shortage is when quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. So that would be when the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. So let's take a look at the supply and demand model for pizza yet again. So here's pizza, and here's the demand for pizza, and here's the supply for pizza. And again, make sure you label the quantity and the price here. So the equilibrium here is Q1 and P1 here. So let's say that the price is, so instead of using P1 right here, let's say it's $2. What happens if you're at the $2.50 price? So let's say you're trying to, the price of pizza is $2.50. What's going to happen is that the quantity supplied is going to be right here, or the quantity demanded, and the quantity supplied is going to be higher. Suppliers want that higher price. So here is going to represent the surplus, which is the quantity supplied minus quantity demanded. Now, how do you get rid of the surplus? It's really simple. At $2.50, there's going to be more supply than there is, more quantity supplied rather than quantity demanded at that point. So basically what ends up happening, using Adam Smith's invisible hand, you're going to converge back to the equilibrium. And this is the magic of supply and demand. When there's a surplus, when the price is above the equilibrium, the market will naturally react, and the price will go back to the equilibrium. Now let's take a look at the same supply and demand for pizza here. And you have the equilibrium where supply and demand intersect, labeled as Q1 here. And let's say that it's $2 right here. Now what happens if the price here of pizza is $1.50? What's going to happen is that the quantity supplied is going to be relatively lower, and the quantity demanded is going to be relatively higher than where the equilibrium is. And this area right here, you're going to see a shortage. And the shortage amount is going to be the quantity demanded minus the quantity supplied. What's basically going to happen is that with the lower price, at $1.50, the market clearing price is $2. So there's going to be more quantity demanded than quantity supplied, and that's going to lead to a shortage. So if the market is left to itself, what's going to happen is that the price will eventually go back to the equilibrium, back to where E1 is. So that's a look at what surplus and shortage would actually look like. So let's take a look at example number 1 here. And it's basically just draw a supply and demand graph with P1 as the equilibrium price and Q1 as the equilibrium quantity. So this one's just the basic supply and demand graph. Again, it doesn't hurt to constantly practice this. If you're at a restaurant, constantly practice drawing supply and demand graphs on napkins as you wait for the food. Find that to be very useful and helpful. And you have the equilibrium quantity right here, and the equilibrium price P1, and this is E1. So even though there's no E2 yet, there's no S1, and there's no S2 or D2, still label that as D1 and S2 here. And so this is the basic supply and demand graph that you'll get. Let's take a look at example number 2. If John's income increases for ice cream, a normal good, if you have more money, you're going to buy more ice cream, graphically illustrates what happens to his demand for ice cream. Well, let's take a look. So here's the supply of ice cream. And here's the demand for ice cream. So if there's an increase in income, there's an increase in demand for the ice cream. Supply stays the same. There's no change at all. So here's demand 2. And here's the new equilibrium for ice cream. We're going to discuss what actually happens in the next lesson, specifically what happens to equilibrium, price, and quantity. But for now, just understand that the equilibrium is where the demand and supply curve intersect. And if there's a new demand curve, it's where the new demand and the only supply curve, that's where they intersect, that's going to be the new equilibrium. All right, well, let's show the difference between a change in quantity demanded for DVDs versus a change in demand for DVDs. Okay, so again, we're going to highlight the difference here. So here's demand for DVDs here, and again, demand for DVDs. So here, this is a change in quantity demanded here. Let's call this P1, P2. So price of DVDs increase from P1 to P2. There is a decrease in quantity demanded. So notice that there's no change in demand, there's just a change in quantity demanded, and it goes from Q1 to Q2. So there's definitely a decrease in quantity demanded, a movement along the demand curve. All right, here we're going to show a situation in which there's a change in demand for DVDs here. Let's say the price of Blu-rays decreases. What's going to happen? Well, if the price of a substitute decreases, there's a positive correlation. Okay, so there's a positive correlation. So if it decreases, then it's also going to decrease here. The demand for DVDs will also decrease. The logic being with a lower price of Blu-rays, then the demand for the DVDs, which is a substitute, would also decrease. So notice here, there's actually a shift in demand from right to left here, whereas when you only increase the price, there's a change in quantity demanded. Again, this is a very important concept, so make sure that you see the difference here between a shift in demand versus a change in quantity demanded. Example number 4. If there's a shortage of water, graphically illustrate what will happen to the supply and demand graph for water. All right, let's go ahead and take a look. So here's the demand for H2O, quantity, and the price. So if there's a shortage of water, so a shortage of water indicates that the price is below equilibrium. So what's going to happen here is, let's say this is P, the price of water here. This is going to be the quantity supplied, quantity demanded. Let's go ahead and put some numbers here. Let's say this number here is 100, and this is 75, and this is 50. What's basically going to happen at the price below, the equilibrium, there's going to be a shortage, and the shortage is going to be the quantity demanded minus the quantity supply. In this case is 100 minus 50. So there's going to be a shortage of 50 bottles of water. Now, if the market is left to basically equilibrate back by itself, what's eventually going to happen is that you will move along back to the equilibrium. But the temporary situation would be there'd be a shortage again, once again, of 50 bottles of water. So moving on to the next example here. So if there's a surplus of purple sweatshirts, let's go ahead and draw a purple sweatshirt right here. So if there's a surplus of purple sweatshirts here, graphically illustrate what will happen to the supply and demand for purple sweatshirts. So let's draw a graph here. The quantity. Here's the supply. Again, by now, drawing these supply and demand graphs should be pretty much second nature. Being able to draw the right notations for these graphs. So if the price is here, price of the sweatshirt, what you're going to have is you're going to have the quantity supplied at the higher price, quantity demanded at the lower price. And here's the surplus. Now again, let's do some numbers here. Let's say this number is 500, this number is 400, and this number is 300. So what's going to end up happening is that there's going to be a surplus of QS minus QD. At the higher price, suppliers are going to be more excited to sell than buyers are going to be excited to buy. And so you're going to have a surplus of 200 purple sweatshirts. Now, again, this is not a very sustainable situation. The way that you get rid of surplus of any item is basically lower the price. So what eventually is going to happen is that the high price is going to be lowered and it's going to converge back to the equilibrium. And so that's basically when the market is left on its own, the markets will equilibrate back to the equilibrium price and quantity. Thank you for watching Educator.com. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I'll see you for the next lesson on changes in supply and demand.